Chapter 24, Part 1 of J.S. Bach, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. J.S. Bach, Volume 2, by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Neumann. Chapter 24, Part 1. The Arnstadt, Mühlhausen, Weimar, and Göttingen cantatas. Vogel maintains that in Bach's earliest compositions the marks of genius are indeed evident, but that, quote, they also contain so much that is unnecessary, so much that is immature, extravagant, and tasteless, that they are not worth preserving, at any rate for the general public, end quote. Only in his 35th year, that is 1720, did Bach, according to his first biographer, attain perfect mastery of polyphony. This is purely fantastic. Only the 3 or 4 very earliest of Bach's cantatas have the air of being experiments. In those that follow, the style is already sure and finished. If ever a composer's period of probation was short, it was his. The Easter cantata, Denn du wirst meine Seele nicht in der Hölle lassen, number 15, belongs to the Arnstadt epoch. Bach appears to have performed it also at some later date. Like the cantatas of the northern composers, it is pompously orchestrated. The final chorale, Weil du vom Tod erstanden bist, with its fanfare like interludes in the wind, is very impressive. Bach would be 18 or 19 years old when this cantata was written. The cantata Gott ist mein König, number 71, was produced at Mühlhausen on 4th February 1708, on the occasion of the election of a new town council. On that day in each year, 1/3 of the council of 48 undertook the conduct of the business of the town until the same date in the following year. The election began with a ceremony in the church. The cantata performed on the occasion was generally printed. This was the case with Bach's cantata. It was the only one issued during his lifetime. The printing, however, was regarded not as a publication for the benefit of Bach, but as an act in honor of the Mühlhausen Council. Footnote: the parts alone were printed, not the score. In the textbook, the cantata is called a glückwünschende Kirchenmotette, congratulatory church motet. The 2 officiating burgomasters were Adolf Strecker and Georg Adam Steinbach. Both the autograph score and the autograph parts have survived. End of footnote. For this festive occasion, there was a brilliant orchestra, 3 trumpets, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, bassoon, first and second violins, viola, violone, kettledrum, and organ. Each instrument has an obbligato part, not separately, however, but as part of a particular orchestral and choral ensemble. There are 3 of these, the first formed by the trumpets, the second by the flutes, oboes, and bassoon, and the third by the strings. The chorale portions are divided between a tutti, which Bach calls coro pleno, and a smaller group that only sings when senza ripieni is indicated. The charm of the work comes from the cooperation and contrast of the 3 instrumental and 2 choral masses. The setting for choir and orchestra of the prayer from the 74th Psalm, Du wollest dem Feinde nicht geben die Seele deiner Turteltaube, is full of feeling. Footnote: Spitta found a fragment of a Bach cantata belonging to the Mühlhausen epoch in the cantor's house at the village of Langula. The wedding cantata, Der Herr denket an uns, must also belong to this time. It was probably composed for the second marriage of the pastor, Stauber. Bach was compelled to write the orchestral part for strings alone. End of footnote. The score of the cantata, Aus der Tiefe rufe ich, number 131, Psalm 130, has at the end the note, quote, Auf Begehren Herrn de Georg Almar, in die Musik gebracht von Johann Sebastian Bach, Orgelmeister Mulhausen, set to music by Johann Sebastian Bach, organist at Mulhausen, by request of Herr D. G. G. Almar. Almar, pastor primarius at the Church of the Blessed Virgin, was a great admirer of church music and a personal friend of Bach's. The only instruments employed in this cantata are strings, oboe, and bassoon. On every page we can see that Bach is beginning to emancipate himself from the northern composers. The orchestral interruptions are not so lengthy as in the two previous cantatas. The young man still follows Buxtehude, however, in the employment of the chorale. In the arioso, So willst du, Herr, Sünde zu rechnen, the soprano sings, Erbarm dich mein, to the melody of Herr Jesu Christu, hustest gut, and the same melody is used in the arioso, Meine Seele wartet. The whole work is so deeply felt and so natural in effect that the modern hearer enjoys it as much as the Mühlhausen audience of 1707. From the first years of the Weimar period we have two cantatas, Nach dir, Herr, verlanget mich, number 150, and Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit, the Actus Tragicus, number 106. The first of these gives a characteristic example of Bach's method of expressing grief and joy. In order to express the anguish of the cry, quote, Nach dir, Herr, verlanget mich, for thee, O Lord, I long, unquote, he employs the chromatic sequence so often met with in the later cantatas.
Nach dir, Herr, verlanget mich.
In the aria, Doch bin und bleib ich vergnügt, yet I am and shall be content, the bass is dominated by the motif of joy. The conclusion, however, is in the form of a chaconne upon a basso ostinato, in which we have an anticipation of the master of the Crucifixus in the B minor Mass. We do not know for whose death the morning cantata Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit, number 106, was written. Spitta's researches show that there was no death in the ducal family at that time. It seems to have been an old man to whom the Mit Fried und Freud fahr ich dahin from Simeon's Song of Praise would be appropriate. The text is as perfect as the music. It is composed of verses from the Bible in which the antithesis is worked out between the Old Testament fear of death and the New Testament joy in death. Quote, Put thy house in order, for thou must die, says the prophet Isaiah, whereupon the chorus joins in with, It is the old decree, end quote. But at once a soprano strikes in, as if hastening hither from another world with the final call of the apocalypse, quote, Yes, come, Lord Jesu, come, to which the orchestra adds the chorale, Ich hab mein Sach Gott heimgestellt, I have cast my care on God, end quote. We can see the cross on Golgotha. The soul repeats the words of Jesus, quote, Into thy hands I commend my spirit, and is answered with the words spoken to the thief, This day shalt thou be with me in paradise. The comforted soul sings, In joy and peace I pass away. Finally the chorale, Glorie, Lob, Ehre und Herrlichkeit, glory, praise, honor, and joy, end quote, is sung to the melody, quote, In dich hab ich gehoffet, Herr, in thee, O Lord, is my hope, end quote. The last line, Through Jesus Christ, Amen, widens out into a brilliant fantasia, which terminates with the theme in augmentation in the orchestra. Bach probably compiled the text of this cantata himself. It was certainly not done by any Weimar poet, for none of the poets of that time would have been so self-denying as to have refrained from introducing verses of his own. In any case, it is one of the most perfect texts from the musical point of view to be found anywhere. The work commences with a sonatina for 2 flutes, 2 gambas, continuo, and organ. It is based on a motif in E-flat, expressive of transfigured grief. This runs through the whole work. To grasp these harmonies is to be transported far from all earthly pain. The words from the Apocalypse come into one's mind that Bach probably had in his, And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow, nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. No other instruments are used in the cantata besides the 2 flutes and the 2 gambas. Their veiled timbre belongs to the very essence of the music. We seem to see an autumn landscape with blue mists floating across it. The dramatic life and the intimate union of words and music in the Actus Traticus specially endeared it to the early admirers of Bach, among them Zelter. The cantata was first publicly revived by the Cecilia Society of Frankfurt on the Main under Orgelbewegung in May 1833. It had to be repeated in December. It was still called for and was given again in each of the 2 following years. It was first published in 1830 by Simrock. If it was the St. Matthew Passion that rescued Bach's music from its Babylonian captivity, it was the Actus Traticus that prepared the path for its return and leveled the ground for it. Even when we know all the cantatas, we always go back with pleasure to this work, written by Bach at the end of his 20th year. The Actus Traticus was the favorite cantata of Julius Stockhausen. On the whole, it is hard to tear ourselves away from these early works, which are the only ones that Bach wrote in the pure form of the old cantata. When he began to supply the regulation cantata for the church service at the Weimar court, he decided in favor of the new style and wrote his music to the free texts supplied him by Salomon Frank and Erdmann Neumeister. Frank lived at Weimar. Neumeister at the time was at Sorau, which town he left for Hamburg shortly afterwards in 1715. Bach's conversion to the modern cantata may be dated about 1712. When he was made Concertmeister in 1714, it became his duty to supply each year a definite number of compositions for the church. In place of dramatic texts compiled from biblical verses and stanzas from hymns, we now get wretched poems that are always cut out to the same pattern. The arioso is supplanted by the da capo aria and the secco recitative. The plan is still further impoverished by the fact that the choir now recedes wholly into the background. It figures only at the beginning and at the end. There is none of the animated alternation between solo and chorus that we find in the Actus Traticus and the cantata Aus der Tiefe. Nor does the composer now try to cast the whole work into one mold. The cantata henceforth divides into separate numbers. How was it possible for Bach to renounce in a moment all the artistic riches that he'd been able to use with such masterly effect in his first cantatas? How can we account for the fact that henceforth he never returned, even in one exceptional case, to the form of the old cantata? As we read the Bible, we regret more than anything that he, a Bible student, should have refrained from setting so many splendid passages that would certainly have been attractive to him as a musician, merely because there were no continuous biblical passages in the cantata form that he had adopted. There is hardly an admirer of his who has not felt that he would give the 200 church cantatas for 100 works in the style of the Actus Traticus. Footnote: It is a curious fact that one of the Bach pioneers, Moritz Hauptmann, though admiring the Actus Traticus, thought its musical structure, quote, a monstrosity of movements that jostle and hang onto each other, end quote. See Hauptmann's letters to Otto Jahn and Hauser in Spitta. Spitta explains Bach's adoption of the da capo aria in this way, quote, when Bach had made himself familiar with the Italian da capo aria, he became conscious of a waste of power, since in this form he could say many things in a simpler and therefore better way, without foregoing any of his originality. End quote. It's hard to see what waste of power there is in composition in the style of the Actus Traticus, nor is it any easier to understand how anything can be better or more simply expressed in the da capo aria than in the old arioso. Spitta is trying to explain the inexplicable without falling back on the only possible solution, that Bach followed the fashion. End of footnote. The chronology of these earliest cantatas presents no difficulties, for the whole style of the works shows that they must have been composed before any of the others. Moreover, in the case of Gott ist mein König, The date of the first performance is noted on the score, and in the case of Austattiefe, a note of Bach's own indicates that it was written in Mühlhausen. The chronological arrangement of the majority of the succeeding cantatas is not so easy to determine. Only a few of them have the year noted on the cover. The approximate dates of the others have to be deduced from external and internal evidence. Spitta and Rust undertook this task independently, and the results obtained by each agree in the main with those of the other. Footnote: see Spitta's remarks and Rust's prefaces. The following chapters are based on Spitta's chronology, the value of which only the professional historian can fully appreciate. End of footnote. The external evidences are those of the handwriting, the style of the notes, and the paper. Bach's writing changed with the years, as may be seen from the specimens given in volume 64 of the Bach-Gesellschaft edition. Cantatas, therefore, in the same handwriting belong to the same period. Much more exact clues, however, are given by certain characteristics of the notation. Bach first adopted the double cross in 1732. It is therefore practically certain that cantatas in which this sign is used belong to a later date than that. There is further the evidence afforded by his way of writing the oboe d'amore part. This instrument, which, according to Walther's Musiklexikon, was invented in 1720, stood a third lower than the ordinary oboe. Bach first uses it in the score of the cantata Die Himmel erzählen die Ehre Gottes, number 76, which bears the date 1723. The new instrument naturally offered some difficulties in the way of notation. Bach experiments. In the B minor Mass, 1733, he writes for it in a new way. In the secular cantatas Angenehmes Widerrau and Schleicht spielende Wellen, that certainly belong to 1737, he adopts another method. These facts enable us to decide whether a cantata was written between 1723 and 1733, between 1733 and 1737, or after 1737. But the most weighty evidence is afforded by the watermarks on the paper he used. The manuscripts exhibit about a half-dozen distinct marks showing that Bach bought large quantities at a time. Cantatas written on paper with the same watermark thus belong to the same period. If we can decide the date of one cantata, it often enables us to settle the chronology of more than a dozen others. Sometimes a valuable clue is given by the writing of those who help to copy out the parts. If it is that of Emmanuel or Friedemann, we know the latest year in which the cantata could have been composed, for we know when these two sons left the paternal house. Interesting data, again, are supplied by the use of the material of secular cantatas for sacred works. In almost every case we know the date of origin of the former, and as we may suppose that the rearrangement was usually made not long after the original, we can fix the date of the new version with some certainty. The problem would be very simple so far as the Leipzig cantatas are concerned if we had the printed version of the texts that were given out for the church music on Sundays and feast days. We possess, however, only 3 of these, one for the Easter feast days, and the 2 following Sundays of the year 1731, one for the Whitsuntide feast days and the Feast of the Trinity of the same year, and one for the Christmas of 1734, the Christmas Oratorio. To some extent, we are compensated for the absence of these programs by the published poems of Picander, who wrote most of the texts for the Leipzig cantatas. Bach composed his cantatas for immediate use. The date of the publication of the text thus gives us also the year when the music was written. Besides these external evidences, there are the internal ones. Bach usually produced, within a short space of time, a series of works having an inner relationship to each other, as if he wished to embody simultaneously in several examples a certain type that engrossed him for the moment. Thus it frequently happens that 4 or 5 cantatas that follow each other according to the order of the ecclesiastical year exhibit a striking similarity among themselves, which is most noticeable as a rule in the structure of the opening choruses. These works, of course, belong to the same period. The problem is therefore not to settle the chronology of isolated cantatas, but that of definite groups that are clearly distinguishable from each other by certain external and internal characteristics, and that can be assigned to a definite period by means of one or two of the works, the date of which can be proved in other ways. Perhaps Schweitzer has occasionally drawn too sweeping conclusions from external evidences, such as that of the cantatas being written on the same paper. This, however, does not affect the general result of his acute inquiry into the chronology of the works. Questions of detail have in this case little practical interest. What does it signify if we cannot be sure whether a given cantata was written a year earlier or a year later? There is no such consistent artistic evolution observable in the succession of Bach's cantatas as there is, for example, in that of Beethoven's symphonies. The distance that Beethoven travels between two symphonies is greater almost than that which Bach traversed in 100 cantatas. Footnote. This, of course, applies only to the cantatas of his period of maturity. In the few youthful cantatas that we possess, we can see a very rapid development. End of footnote. He is one of those rare personalities that do not become, but always are. We could almost say that his cantatas form a closed circle. The last resemble the first, if by the first we understand those in which he adopts the new style of cantata. In his Weimar period, he set about a dozen of Frank's texts to music. He was fond of this poet, being attracted by his mysticism and his deep feeling for nature. He may also have liked Frank for his habit of making more use of verses from the Bible than Neumeister and the others did. He was, on the whole, the most conservative of the new school. One of the best known of the Bach cantatas to a text by Frank has always been Ich hatte viel Bekümmernis, number 21. The cover of the score is inscribed, quote, Per ogni tempo, concerto a 13, 3 trombe, tamburi, ein oboe, 2 violini e viola, fagotto and violoncello, 4 voci con continuo di G.S. Bach, den 3. Post Trinitas, 1714. End quote. Diligent research has failed to discover the part for the drums. A knowledge of Bach's style, however, makes it easy to supply it. In any case, it is absolutely essential in performance. The cantata is in two parts. The first was given before the sermon, the second after it. One result of this division is that the work has no real culminating point. It is not quite clear at which moment grief gives way to consolation. Like the Actus Tragicus, which it resembles also in many other ways, this cantata is prefaced by a sinfonia, founded on an affecting dialogue between the oboe and the first violins, the other instruments supplying the harmonies. In the choruses, the alternation between the voice parts and the instrumental ensemble ceases. The orchestra strives to be independent, though with only occasional success. Very frequently, it merely doubles the vocal parts or ceases altogether. The theme of the first chorus runs thus. It is identical with that of an organ fugue, with the exception that the latter is in the major, Peters II, page 7. The chorus, Sei nun wieder zufrieden, with which are inwoven two verses of the chorale, Wer nur den lieben Gott lässt walten, is extraordinarily sonorous. The plaintive theme of the aria, Seufzer, Tränen, Kummer, Not, woven as it were out of sighs. Is very characteristic. The painting of the storm at the words Sturm und Wellen in the aria Bäche von gesalzenen Tränen is precise and expressive. We do not know how it could be improved on. The declamation is not faultless, as Matheson pointed out with a certain malicious joy. We must agree with him that the fourfold repetition of the word Ich at the commencement of the first chorus is somewhat ill-considered. We have here a reminiscence of the old motet style. Matheson's censure of the declamation in the duet Komm, Herr Jesu, und erquicke, is, however, unjustifiable. Even Bach's great biographer, Spitta, does not find this duet to his liking. Quote, "The duet," he says, "is what church music should never be, dramatic. Bach's delight in polyphonic working has made him unintentionally, no doubt, accentuate the dramatic element to an almost painful point when the voices bandy to and fro incessantly the words, Ach nein, ach ja, du hassest mich, ich liebe dich." The only mitigating circumstance is that the soprano part would be sung in those days by a boy, which would partly prevent the duet from having the appearance of a charming love duet, as it always has now. End quote. His fears were groundless. Anyone who's free from prudery in matters of church music must delight in this ardent dramatic piece, and be deeply affected by the dialogue of the soul with its comforter. If anything can be objected to, it is the da capo form in which Bach has cast the duet, with the result that the entreaty, Komm, mein Jesu, und erquicke mich, is repeated at the end after the Saviour in the middle section, Ach Jesu, durchsüsse mir Seele und Herze, has banished care and sorrow. But the mystical love glow that finds such eloquent expression in Bach's works cannot be objected to from any standpoint of church music. So long as the Song of Solomon remains in the Bible, its allegorical language cannot be forbidden in religious music. Bach, a Lutheran and a mystic, delights in the Song of Solomon, as does his librettist, Frank. This can be seen in the two cantatas, Komm, du süße Todesstunde, No. 161, for the 16th Sunday after Trinity, 1715, and Ach, ich sehe jetzt, da ich zur Hochzeit gehe, No. 162, for the 20th Sunday after Trinity, 1715, in which the ideas of the Song of Solomon and the Apocalypse are blended. There is ardent longing in the song of the two flutes that accompanies the words. Quote, Komm, du süße Todesstunde, da mein Geist Honig speist, aus des Löwen Munde, mach meinen Abschied süße, säume nicht letztes Licht, dass ich meinen Heiland küsse. Come, thou sweet hour of death, for my soul is fed with honey from the mouth of the lion. Make my farewell sweet. Delay not, O my last light, the moment when I shall kiss my Saviour. End quote. The organ accompanies this with the chorale, Herzlich tut mich verlangen. The aria, Mein Verlangen ist, den Heiland zu umfangen, grows out of the sigh of yearning. In the recitative, the soul pictures death to itself as a soft sleep, and at once the instruments sink downwards in blissful lassitude. At the idea of the resurrection, joy breaks forth and continues in clear tones while the alto sings, quote, So schlage doch, du letzter Stundenschlag. Strike then, last hour. Unquote. The chorus concludes with the chorale strophe, quote, Wenn es meines Gottes Wille, wünsch ich, dass des Liebes Last heute noch die Erde fülle. End quote. If it is the Lord's will, let the earth take today the burden of my body. End quote. This funeral song is surrounded by the orchestra with exultant demi-semi-quavers. The cantata, Ach, ich sehe jetzt, da ich zur Hochzeit gehe, No. 162, is as a rule of a severer beauty. In the aria, quote, In meinem Gott bin ich erfreut, I rejoice in my God, end quote, the bass leaps joyously in a veritable dance. The chorus contributes only the final chorale. End of chapter 24, part 1. Read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2021.